thing. Yeah.
Was it open too or just compound?
It was open and it got infected.
Oh.
So.
I had a compound of a fracture on my right arm.
Yeah.
Was it open or closed?
Compound image.
Ooh.
Yeah. You've got a scar still. He will too. Yeah.
I had 3 surgeries.
Oh, no.
Yesterday was Thomas's 5th. So.
Also, he really.
Yeah. It was the infection is why they'd have to go back in there several times. Okay. So I'm going to give you a homework assignment right now, homework 6. So we're going to do this similar to the assignment that you submitted yesterday where, for most of the assignments this semester it's been due on a class day. But for this one I wanted to give you just a little bit of extra time. And so this one will be due on Wednesday, March 8th. So this has a couple of bond problems just to keep your memory fresh on those. We have an exam coming up after spring break. It'll include a bond question, and so I don't want you to forget how to solve those between now and then. There's also on next week, we're going to have a special class on March 9th. On Thursday, we're going to meet over in Drinko Library. Thank you. And so, Drinko Library 349, 3rd floor. It's kind of a, not an auditorium, but kind of a lecture hall that they have in the library. And it's a lecture that's being given by Dr. Zatar on structural assessment. And I think that there could be some tie-ins to issues related to engineering economics there, because what they're trying to do is learn about ways to assess concrete and potentially lengthen the life of infrastructure that otherwise would have to be torn out and replaced. And so it's kind of a technique that's meant to increase the service life of equipment. So we'll meet over there in Drinko Library on Thursday, and of course I'll announce that again next week on Tuesday, but just wanted to put it out there and draw your attention to that things will be a little bit different next week. So any questions on these 2 announcements? The other announcement, of course, is about on Wednesday of next week, the Career Expo. And I think many of you may have class at 4 o'clock, but if you're there right at 3, I know that the employers will be eager to hear from you, and taking your resume over there is a great idea, and making connections, getting business cards. So there's going to be a lot of good employment opportunities over there at the Career Expo next Wednesday. So I guess that kind of means that the homework submission deadline's 3 o'clock by de facto, right? This says you've got until 4, but if you're going to the Career Expo at 3, then maybe that's your deadline, effectively. That's all right. I'm sure you can do it. All right, so today we're going to talk about benefit cost analysis. And so far this semester, what we've been doing is focusing mainly on ways that for-profit enterprises can identify the alternatives that's going to maximize revenue and maximize profits. And that's great. If you're a publicly listed company, for example, you have a duty as an executive for a publicly listed company where stock is sold on the exchanges. Your duty is to maximize value that's returned to the shareholders, and so you're supposed to maximize profit. That's supposed to be your goal. In fact, there's been a lot of talk in the news recently about Biden may be doing his first veto. Did anybody see that headline? It came out yesterday. So I think it was the House and the Senate have passed a rule that revokes the ability for corporate CEOs to take into account environmental and sustainability issues in their decision making, where, before this rule, CEOs were only supposed to maximize profit. But then the Biden administration passed a law that said, no, you don't just have to maximize profit. You can also take environmental and sustainability goals into account. And so the Senate just passed a law saying, no, you can't. And so Biden's going to veto their law. And so it's just this ping-ponging back and forth of whether for-profit companies should only focus on maximizing shareholder value, or they should also take into account things like the environment. So the tools you've learned in this class have mainly been ways to choose from among alternatives and pick the things that results in the most amount of money. But of course, there are other things besides money in this world that are valuable. So if you think about the fact that people donate on an individual basis and also on a national basis, they'll donate money and food and relief supplies to alleviate hunger and famine. And of course, there was a lot in the news recently about the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria and the damage that it's done there. And so if your goal is to maximize profits, then people wouldn't do stuff like that. And so it's just, I guess, maybe an illustration that there can be other motivations besides maximizing profit. Because if self-interest was the only force that governed every decision, then things like highway guardrails may not make sense. Because, steel is expensive, and putting steel guardrails up alongside of a road when people aren't paying to drive past those guardrails. And of course, they're funded in part by tax on fuel and maybe vehicle registration fees. But the point is that those guardrails are put into place because there's a value that's put on something non-economic. There's a value put on human health and on safety. And so if just maximizing profit was the objective, then it maybe wouldn't make sense to put in a wall like this next to a highway. And has anybody seen a wall like this before? Ben, what is that?
That is like a sound barrier.
That's right.
And there's probably, if I'm gonna guess, there's probably a multi-million or even billion-dollar subdivision development behind it with $2-3 million houses each.
Yeah.
That's not a subdivision around here.
That's just, it's speculating that that's an affluent area where the people have the means to protest against road noise. You can drive along the freeway here, and it's sometimes shocking to me how close people will build next to the interstate. And sometimes they're really nice houses, too. I'm thinking, if you've got the money to build a house that nice, why would you be 100 yards next to Interstate 64? Maybe some people, the noise doesn't bother them, but most people consider highway noise as kind of like a pollutant, and it reduces and degrades their quality of life. And so if maximizing profit is the objective, you wouldn't necessarily put in a noise barrier like that. But especially in Europe, there is a really high premium put on quality of life. For instance, there's an international airport in Zurich, and they don't allow any flights to come in and out of that airport. I think 8 a.m. is the earliest. I could be wrong with the exact hour, but the point is that, if you think about airports around here, there are flights coming and going at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and people who live near the airport, too bad. But in Zurich, they say, people should be able to sleep through the night without being disturbed by aircraft noise, and so no late or early traffic in and out of the Zurich airport. So it's very interesting. There are values other than maximizing profit. If you think about the quality of a river, let me just dim the lights a little bit so you can appreciate that's a beautiful lake, but it's just absolutely throttled with what looks like plastic pollution, and there's probably a lot of plastic bags in there, and And so if we only cared about profits, we'd do a lot more ocean dumping of garbage than we do, because nobody has to be paid when you dump garbage in the ocean. But it's very expensive to bury garbage in a sanitary landfill. The regulations that are in place right now for a sanitary landfill in the United States specify that the trash is supposed to go onto dirt that's about a foot thick, and underneath the dirt is a layer of a very thick and hardy plastic called a geomembrane, which is supposed to be a certain thickness so that there isn't going to be any permeability with like water that may be banging around in the garbage, because the water in a garbage dump becomes very contaminated with the pollutants that are in batteries and household trash. And so below that plastic layer is 3 feet of compacted clay, which has a very low hydraulic conductivity, and water can't get through the compacted clay very easily. And then beneath the compacted clay is another layer of plastic. And then there's supposed to be a system in place to drain any leachate away. So any kind of water that makes its way through the liner is supposed to be collected and treated. So they're very serious about minimizing the impact of trash. And of course, they cover the trash as well on a daily basis. They can't allow any trash to remain uncovered. So dumping it in the ocean is what we do if profit was the only objective. But when there are other goals in mind, like preserving environmental quality, preserving living quality of life, safety, kind of the humanitarian goals, it's not just always about the money. There are other objectives. And so the tools that we've talked about this semester, like the internal rate of return, the external rate of return, those may not be as useful in assessing opportunities like this, because these may be cost-only alternatives that don't generate a profit. So, you'd be looking at a negative rate of return, and so we need some other way to evaluate and compare alternatives. Now, COVID is just another example of how people had to balance profit and other factors as well. Businesses shut down, companies really laid off a lot of people, and there was a great deal of attention that went into funding of public health. And so balancing that, I think everybody would agree that a lot of countries did it poorly, and that there were a lot of mistakes that were made. And so it's just it'll be years, decades before we have a clear understanding of what were the costs, and hopefully people will be able to learn from that in the future and do a better job. So let's talk about public sector projects. These are the ones that may not generate profit, but maybe are worth doing even though they have costs but not revenue. And so, for instance, it wouldn't be a very productive society if we didn't have highways and bridges and waterways, if we didn't have the infrastructure in place to go from one city to the next, then it would interfere with your ability to visit people, it would interfere with commerce. And so the highway itself doesn't generate money, but it facilitates things that are beneficial for society. All of these projects can be owned either at the level of the government. Sometimes they'll be owned privately by big entities, but these kinds of projects typically take a very long time to pay off their upfront initial costs of construction. So there are, for example, private water companies. Here in West Virginia, we have West Virginia American Water as our water company. They are in the business of selling water. They're not necessarily in the business of putting pipes into the ground initially. They've usually taken over other water systems that used to be publicly owned. And of course, they do upkeep on their infrastructure, but the list of public sector projects will often include things that could be considered monopolies, where it doesn't make sense to have multiple gas networks in a city. They're just because of the difficulty of putting the pipes in the ground and the space that they take and the complexity of making sure that there isn't interference between sewer lines, gas lines, water lines, electric lines, and so on. It only makes sense usually to have one of them. And so if you look at these different kinds of activities, the public sector projects, many of them will be exclusive operations that either a municipal agency or some sort of an authority that is semi-for-profit may operate. So like an airports commission sometimes generates a modest amount of profit, but it's just reinvested into future upgrades for the airport. Chicago has a large airport already, but it's constantly expanding, and they're just always looking to build out new capacity at the big hub airports. So some of these could be owned by the citizens of the government. Sometimes they're owned by operators who have a concession, like in the case of a toll road. There can be just small segments of roads that are privately owned and operated when there is a high enough traffic on that route to justify the collection of toll fees and so on. So the definition of a public sector project is that its primary purpose is to generate a good to the citizens, but not to generate profit. The purpose is some sort of a non-monetary advantage, whether it is the reduction of disease by sewage treatment or the ability to have commerce and travel, schools. If you think about the high cost of educating young people, schools don't generate profit directly, but the benefits of them have an influence on how profitable a society can be, because a well-educated workforce is going to attract businesses, and it's going to enable better paying jobs. And so it's not to say that all of these things are completely unrelated to monetary effects, because they can have very significant monetary effects, but they also have benefits that aren't directly related to money. And so we have to find some way to quantify those benefits, and that's what we'll look at in a bit. Just to compare and contrast some of the characteristics of the private company projects and large public projects that we are going to be talking about now. One of the reasons why sometimes the public has to do certain projects is that it costs so much money to make the initial investment. And so dredging a port and building up the facilities for ships can be very, very expensive and more costly than a small firm would maybe be able to raise money for. And so that's an example of why public funds maybe would be used to develop a port, whether it's an airport or a port for ships. The time frame for public projects is usually much longer compared to the anticipated useful life of some sort of a private investment being much shorter. Public projects are supposed to be done for these social reasons and not necessarily to generate a profit. That's a big difference from a private project, where that's the primary incentive, is trying to develop future revenues that justify the original investment. Public institutions can generally borrow money at lower rates than private companies can. And one of the reasons why is that governments have an advantage over companies. And the advantage that the government has is that they have a legal right to tax the citizens. Like IBM or Apple or Tesla or Toyota, I mean, they make useful things, but you're not legally obligated to buy their products. But you are legally obligated to pay taxes to the state of West Virginia and pay taxes to the United States government. And so it's easier for government agencies to be considered trustworthy from an economic standpoint, creditworthy. They have the ability to borrow money at a lower interest rate generally than most companies do, because they've got this guaranteed source of revenue, which is their taxation authority. So that's why interest rates are lower for public projects than for private projects, is they're seen as more secure if they're backed by the government. Selection criteria means that in the case of a private project, you're just mainly looking for rate of return and maximizing profit. But when you're choosing alternatives in a public project, you're trying to balance a lot of competing factors. You may be balancing things like how does it look to the people who live in the area. You may be balancing issues related to what impact is it going to have on businesses in the area in terms of when something's being built, the construction could cause delays, or it could cause motorists not to go into a certain parking lot. If you're deciding, for example, to build a dam along a river, you may have to be balancing the issue of homes that are going to be submerged versus the flood control benefits. And so there's just a lot of different criteria, whether social factors, environmental factors, economic factors, just a lot of things that are being balanced out in a public project. And that's why the process of politics is used for evaluation, where you may have public meetings, and there are representatives of people who oftentimes are the ones who are going to make the decision on a public project. And so it's, politics is supposed to be the art of compromise and the way of making decisions when there is a lot of competing demands and competing opinions. So just one last point to make is that just because a project can be funded with government money doesn't mean that it's free money. And so the funds that are used for public projects are funds that could have been used by the citizens for something else that's of a higher priority to them. And so, for example, when they decide to build a new flood wall in a town that keeps getting flooded over and over again, and the people should probably just move, but they don't, and so the government just keeps giving them flood relief money and putting in a flood wall for this town that is never going to be quite right. All of the money that they spend for projects like that is kind of sometimes seen as free money by the people in the town. But of course, it's money that the government got by collecting it from other people whose priorities maybe aren't to preserve a town that is in a location that is threatened by the floodwaters. And so we just always have to keep in mind when we're looking at public sector projects that that there's an opportunity cost, that every dollar that's spent on one project is a dollar that can't be spent on something else. And so just to take that example, and localize it, sometimes here at Marshall, they act like because private funds were used to build a new baseball stadium, that the fact that it's going to be like a $10 million stadium and nobody in America really watches baseball anymore, they act like that's okay. But, well, it's private funds. It wasn't Marshall's funds. It was a donor. But they could have got the donor to donate that money probably for something else. Like if they have an affinity for Marshall, they could have convinced them to support academic programs or, help with the deferred maintenance on campus. And so it's the opportunity cost that we have to keep in mind, that when you're spending money for one thing, that means that that same opportunity can't be, that same resources can't be used somewhere else. Okay, so think about how much you hate sitting in traffic. And does anybody have to drive on Interstate 64 regularly? Anybody in here? No? You're so fortunate, because it's been closed a lot recently. I-64, I think in the last 3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, it's been closed 3 times because of accidents. Now, they're doing construction on I-64, and I think that's part of why there keeps having accidents, is like there's a lot of odd lane configuration changes and barriers in places that people aren't expecting them, and of course it's hard to drive through all that when you're texting. So
it's hard to drive through in context.
Yeah, that's true. So a lot of people have been stuck in traffic on I-64 lately. And how much would you pay to get out of traffic? An hour. If you had to sit in traffic that just wasn't moving for an hour, how much would you pay to get out of that? $50. $50?
$5.
Mine is maybe somewhere between 50 and 5.
50 is the max for sure. It just depends on the day.
It depends on the day because, the question is, where are you going? Are you going to a wedding? Yeah, you'd pay $50 if you're going to be late for the wedding, especially if it's your wedding. But, I mean, if you're in no hurry and you've got all your friends in the car and you're just going to be sitting in front of the TV anyway, maybe it's not as bothersome. Well, yeah, okay. So there's a field of economics that tries to figure out how much is it actually worth avoiding delay of sitting in traffic. And they take into account the value of people's time, the cost, wear and tear of a vehicle, of just running for an hour and not actually going anywhere, the cost of fuel. And so if you're going to be building a new lane in a road to alleviate congestion, of course, the costs are easy to quantify because you know the cost of the asphalt, you know the cost of the steel barrier along the side of the road. The construction costs are quantitative and monetary inherently, but the benefits, like a reduction in delay, can be a little bit more difficult to put a dollar value on. But we still try and estimate it anyway. The same thing goes for illness. Oftentimes the county public health agency will give like the flu vaccine for free. And that costs them money to do that, but the reason why they do is that they're figuring that there's some sort of a benefit. If you avoid getting the flu, then you can go to work, you don't feel bad, maybe there's a certain number of people who get the flu and die, and so there's an economic cost of that. And so what they'll do is they'll figure up the value of the problems that are avoided, and they'll consider that the benefits. Like if you had a 1% dying and a human life is worth $1 million, then the benefits would be 1% of $1 million. If you had a 5% chance of hospitalization and the average hospitalization is $20,000 for the flu, then they'll say the value is going to be 5% of that $20,000. And so they'll add together all of the benefits, and then they'll say, at a population level, does the cost of distributing these vaccines, is it justified by the benefits that we might have? And they'll also try to just take into account things like enjoyment. Now, in the case of avoiding death or being able to go to work, there's a pretty direct economic side of that. But for people to go fishing, it's really hard to say what is the value of 1 hour of enjoyment in nature. But there are people who that's their job. They try and through surveys and studying people's behavior and maybe like the spending that they do on the equipment implies how much they value the activity. If you're willing to spend $200 on a fancy rod and $50 on a net, and you're willing to drive for an hour to get there, there's some implied value of the experience based on what the person is willing to go through to go do it. And so recreational opportunities can also be quantified. They'll try and translate something that's inherently non-economic into a dollar value of the benefit. So any kind of activity, you can calculate the costs pretty directly, but the benefits sometimes you have to get creative to estimate. So we're not going to go into the creative part of trying to figure out what are the dollar value benefits of some non-economic activities, but we are going to calculate ratios that interpret whether or not public service projects are justified. So monetizing is just turning some sort of an activity into an equivalent dollar value. So each aspect of a project's effect is going to be monetized, meaning all of the benefits and disbenefits, we're going to try and assess a cost with that. or excuse me, we're going to try and translate it into a dollar value. So just to use some terminology here, a benefit is seen as the advantage of a project to the public. And so here's some examples of an advantage, like saving time, improvements to reliability, improved safety, environmental protection, leisure, increased business revenue. All of these would be advantages that arise when you do a project. There's also disbenefits, which could be like an unintended consequence, or maybe just an unavoidable consequence of a public service project, like if during the construction phase of a project, if it causes delay, which is like what we're experiencing right now on I-64, hopefully in the long run, it'll be good that they added those extra lanes. But in the short run, there have been accidents, there's been delay, there's a reduction maybe in the tranquility for the people who live near that freeway. They've got the construction noise. So the disbenefits or the disadvantages that arise from a project. And of course, the costs are pretty straightforward, but we break the costs in a public service project into two different components. There's the initial cost, which is usually the construction cost, and then the ongoing recurring costs would be related to maintenance and operation. So we have two different kinds of costs. Now, for us to be able to calculate a ratio, we have to take all the money to the same time frame. Remember, we can't add $1 10 years from now together with $1 at the present. We have to take all of the money to the same time to be able to do combinations or ratios. And so that same principle will apply here in public service projects. We have to either take everything to a present worth or an annual worth or a future worth. Now, in the formulas I'm going to show you, costs are already known to be outflows, and so you don't have to use the minus sign in these ratios. And if there is going to be a savings from the government, a saving to the government as a result of some sort of a project, that would just be considered a direct economic benefit that is subtracted from the cost. So if, for example, building a smoother road saves the state of West Virginia a little bit of money on the fuel expenses that they put into their vehicle fleet, then you'd just reduce the cost of the project by an equivalent amount of the savings. So those savings aren't considered as benefits. Okay, so write this formula down because this is an important one. This conventional B to C ratio says that in the numerator, what we include are the benefits minus the disbenefits, and then in the denominator we have the costs, and the two costs, remember, are the initial costs plus the maintenance and operation costs. They all have to be at the same time frame. So either everything has to be at the present, or everything has to be at the future, or we can calculate the annual equivalent of the benefits, the disbenefits, the initial cost, and maintenance and operation. So think about all of these. Usually, only the initial construction cost will be at the present. Everything else is usually a recurring annual amount. So the benefits of the project would happen every year, the disbenefits happen every year, maintenance and operation costs happen every year. So usually what you'll be doing is either taking the B, D, and C sub M and O, taking all of that to the present to calculate this ratio, or taking the initial construction cost and annualizing it. And then you can put it into this ratio. Now, the decision criteria of how you know whether a project is acceptable is a project is acceptable if this ratio is greater than 1. Greater than 1 means the benefits outweigh the costs. Or to think about it another way, it means that you're getting more than $1's worth of benefit value for every $1 in cost. So that's what you want. You wouldn't want to spend $1 and get less than $1 of return. So as long as the ratio is greater than or equal to 1, then that tells you that there is at least as much benefit as cost, and hopefully more. Do you have a question?
Who's responsible for benefit and disbenefit costs. I'm assuming it'd be, you know, local officials and stuff, but like a benefit to me is gonna be different than a benefit to you because we're two different people and we live two different, completely separate lives. So
That's right. Yeah, so I think, you know, an economist who does this sort of thing has to probably have some sort of a representative cross-section of the population that's being served and integrate each individual person's preferences and try and take into account not just an average, but maybe kind of like a weighted representation of everyone's individual preferences. And the interesting thing is that the history of this B2C analysis actually, it came into being because of the agency that you work for, the Army Corps of Engineers.
I would never believe that.
Yeah. Back in the 1930s, the Army Corps of Engineers just built dozens and dozens of dams that weren't justified. And so I think the federal government insisted that they start to be a little bit more rigorous in proving that projects were justified. I think in recent years probably that fiscal discipline has fallen off, where now politicians meddle, and you know, if there's an important politician from Kentucky and he wants a certain small town to have flood protection, then he makes sure that the Army Corps will build a flood wall around this podunk town that maybe...
Or completely move the town, like the town of Martin.
Yeah.
They buy the whole town out and move it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's projects that we worked on that it'd be cheaper to just buy everybody new houses.
Yeah. I've spoken to people at the Corps who said that they've worked on projects where they just know it's just a waste of money, that the value of what they're protecting is way, way less than what's being spent to protect it. So, unfortunately...
Some of them were good, though.
Yeah, of course.
That was great.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all sorts of benefit for flood protection on the wider scale. There's plenty of projects that are beneficial. So this is the conventional. There's also what's known as a modified B2C ratio. The only difference there is that the costs are put in, of maintenance and operation, are put into the numerator and subtracted from the benefits. But the same criteria applies, that the ratio should be greater than 1. Okay, so let's get some practice using this ratio. I've got an in-class exercise, and by the way, there is, I think, a problem on the homework I've given you where you're going to be using this for the last problem. Okay, you can see that on the back of the paper is the 4% factor table, because you're going to have to use the present worth method, or I guess you could take the construction costs and annualize them. But what you'll notice is that the construction costs include some amount that's already at time 0, but it's a 5-year construction period. And so everything needs to be either taken to the present and then put in the ratio, or everything has to be taken to an annual basis and put into the ratio. I'll leave it to you. I think what I did was I took everything to the present and then started putting it into the conventional modified. I've taken off the profitability index from your in-class exercise paper here, so you're not going to need to do part G that's shown on the screen. But let me pause now, give you a chance to, first of all, I suggest sketching the cash flow diagram just so you can kind of visualize what's being described here, the different construction costs, maintenance, and so on. So somebody's already done the creative part of this, which is translating the benefits of the highway into dollar values and quantifying the disbenefits. All of that's already been done. All you're going to need to do is put it into the ratio. Okay, so for example, for the initial costs, we're just going to be using the $4 million that's already at the present, and the $18 million, since that's repeating for 4 years, we can do the P/A factor for that. And then there's the single $4 million out there at year 5 that we need to discount to the present. So you should get that it's $72.6 million for the initial costs. So the reason why we are calculating kind of separately these different things rather than combining it together is that the conventional and the modified B/C ratio puts the maintenance and operation in a different place. Like in the modified, it goes into the numerator, but in the conventional, it goes in the denominator combined with the initial costs. So that's why the instructions are suggesting that what you need to do is kind of, first of all, calculate the initial cost, then maintenance and operation, benefits, disbenefits. We're finding the present value of it all so that when we can put it into the ratios. I know this is a lot of calculations. What I'll do is I'm going to email you a copy of the, let me bring it up on the screen so that you can see it. Didn't realize that I turned off the screen. So what I'll do is I'm going to email you a copy of this just in case you're still crunching the numbers. You know, here we are running out of time, but I'll email you the solution of this. And it's, I think, good practice to use the present worth method and just kind of break down a cash flow diagram and think about what are the solution steps to get everything to the present. But then when you do that, what you should get is that the conventional B/C is 0.414 and the modified B/C should be 0.305. So like I say, I'll email you that just so that as you continue your calculations and check them, you can make sure that you've got the right numbers. Just to revisit our announcements, remember you've got a new homework assignment in your queue, which will be collected next Wednesday by 4. And then Thursday of next week, we're going to have class over in Drinko Library. So I'll see you next Tuesday.